Hi, and welcome back to the first video of the 7th lecture of Covidenomics. This 7th video is really a bit of a bridge. We've pushed the general analysis of the economics of the pandemic, the interaction between economics and epidemiology, the policies that governments put in place to deal with the pandemic at a broad level. We've pushed that about as far as we can. We have effectively hit the research frontier in the last set of videos. Now what we want to move on to is thinking about some of the micro behaviour, the individual consumer behaviour or individual business behaviour. So things like panic buying, things like price gouging, hoarding of goods, those sorts of very much industrial organisation type of issues. This lecture is going to bridge those two. So in this short group of lectures, what we're going to do is take a bit of a helicopter view of what's happened in Australia, and then we're going to do some predictions. We're going to use some basic economics to try and predict, well, what will happen post-pandemic in particular industries? Where should we be paying attention? Just on the material that I'm going to be using in this particular video, can I thank my colleagues at the Productivity Commission who put together pretty much all of the data and the graphs and the charts that I'm going to be using here. Thanks, guys. There's a couple that aren't from there. I'll state those on the way through, though. Let's start off by giving a bit of a timetable for the progress of COVID-19 in Australia. So the first case was confirmed on January 25th. Pretty quickly after that, there were entry bans put on foreign nationals entering from high-risk areas. But the main interventions occurred a few weeks after that. National Cabinet had its first meeting on March 15th, and really in the week after that, going through 16th through to the 24th, 25th, we had a lot of action on these stage 1 restrictions. So banning on non-essential gatherings, the 4 metre square rule for retail spaces, restaurants and so on. They then progressed so that by the 26th of March we'd moved into stage 2 restrictions, and by the 30th of March we'd moved into stage 3 restrictions. Of course, as we've noted elsewhere, it's not just the government rules that bring in reactions. We'd already seen changes in behaviour due to the pandemic before and at the same time as the government restrictions were coming on. So, for example, if we look at short-term visitor arrivals, they were about 26% lower in February 2020 compared to February 2019, and that's significantly more than just the ban that was in place. The March quarter GDP fell by about 0.3%, and the Grattan Institute reported that even before stage 1 restrictions came into place, crowding in CBDs of our largest cities had almost halved from what they saw as the normal levels. So there was a lot of endogenous behaviour, a lot of endogenous reaction by the community. This set of graphs also captures that endogenous behaviour change. The data is from a survey and different waves of the survey that the Melbourne Institute's been doing throughout the progress of the pandemic. And you can see what this is showing if you concentrate on the darker bar and the light blue bar here. They're the people that are restricting activities outside their home either most, all or some of the time because of concerns about contracting COVID-19. So above and beyond the fact that there may be limits in place put by the government. And those two bars together tend to be around 70% of the people surveyed, and that tends to be pretty constant over time. So only about 30% of the people or less are not concerned about COVID-19 and are not changing their behaviour because of COVID-19. The pandemic changed what people spent their money on. And so if we look at, for example, essentials, they spiked up around the middle of March. Think rush for toilet paper, hand sanitizer, cleaning products and so on. And we're going to talk about those rushes, that panic buying that we saw in Australia and elsewhere in the world. We're going to talk about that in one of the later videos. In contrast, discretionary spending fell, and really, once we hit that April period, even the essential spending was down. So overall spending, given by this green line, was quite a bit down. It started to recover back to normal levels May, June, and then obviously starts to separate out depending on which state you're in, because of course some states, particularly Melbourne, went back into lockdown. Unsurprisingly, the pandemic had a huge hit on both business confidence and on consumer confidence, and that's reflected by this graph here. So we've got the historic pattern of consumer and business confidence from 2000 up to the present. You've got the global financial crisis in here, and the downturn and the drop in consumer and business confidence following the global financial crisis. But the current drop due to the pandemic is much sharper and also deeper even than that drop in confidence following the global financial crisis. Unsurprisingly, the drop in business confidence, the drop in consumer confidence, the drop in consumer spending all gets reflected in a pretty big drop in employment around April, May 2000. What's happening here? Well, a few things. First off, the drop in employment did lead to about a 1% rise in Australia's unemployment rate in May, and that was expected to continue rising into June. Secondly, we had a significant drop in the participation rate. In other words, quite a number of people decided it wasn't even worth looking for a job in the pandemic. The third thing that was happening at the same time is that there was a big jump in the number of people who reported being underemployed. Now, that reflects a few things. One, it reflects full-time workers who have had their hours reduced. There's simply not enough work for them, even though they're still employed, or part-time workers who really would like some more hours. Australia's rise in unemployment around this period of time, getting up towards 7%, was significantly less than in some other countries. So, for example, in the United States, their unemployment rate had been less than Australia's. It went up to about 11% over the same period of time. Part of a reason for our relatively modest rise in unemployment was a novel policy intervention called JobKeeper. The idea behind JobKeeper was to pay a wage subsidy to businesses that were hit hard by the pandemic. That subsidy was $1,500 every 2 weeks, every fortnight, which the business then paid through to its workers. Those workers were then able to be employed formally by the business. Why do this? Why not just have the business get rid of the workers? The workers could then receive unemployment benefits. Well, when you've got a temporary shock like a pandemic, you want to keep the connection between a business and the workers. If that connection gets lost, if the workers are formally sacked, if they become unemployed, they'll start looking around for new jobs. The business will go into a hiatus. When the pandemic disappears, when the economy starts to recover, the business is going to start looking for workers. Some of its old workers may be available, but some won't be. And so there becomes bigger costs to restart the economy, to get that matching between workers and employers. So JobKeeper was meant to short-circuit that, to help keep those links between employers and employers during the economic downturn caused by the pandemic. Now, Australia wasn't the only country to do this. For example, the UK did it, and a number of other countries. And it was interesting to see these innovations to try and make sure that when we're thinking about policies to deal with the pandemic, we were actually thinking how to help the economy recover after the pandemic as well. Unsurprisingly, the shocks associated with the pandemic were not evenly distributed. They affected, in particular, the industries that were forced to shut down or had significant limitations placed on them due to the pandemic. So, for example, food and beverage services, air transport, creative and performing arts activities, sports, recreation activities, those sort of areas were pretty heavily hit. That meant that there was a big impact, particularly on younger workers and on female workers who were a significant part of the workforce in those particular industries. And that's what is reflected in these charts here, where we have the biggest impact on people 20 to 29 and under 20, and there's a bigger impact on women than there are on men. That same sort of differentiation is reflected here in some numbers that are put together by the Queensland Productivity Commission. So again, you can see that women in Australia have been affected more than men, so the light blue versus the dark blue line, and in particular younger people are affected more than in general older workers. And finally, this graph captures the different effects for reductions of employment across different industries. So up the top here, accommodation and food, recreation, they're areas where there were big reductions in employment between March and May. Some areas a lot less affected, so finance, utilities, public administration. There were drops in these areas, but not nearly as big a drops in terms of the level of employment. An important economic question is how many of these changes are going to be permanent and how many are going to be temporary. So for example, is it just the case that there's been a fundamental shift in food and beverages? We've all got used to getting Uber Eats and takeaway delivered to our home. We won't be going back into restaurants. Restaurants that have been innovative and have put together cook-at-home style packages, are they going to be fine? But their in-restaurant businesses, are they going to take a long time to recover, if they ever recover? So will there be permanent changes in behaviour by consumers due to the pandemic? Similarly, we've seen a big increase in online shopping and online activities due to the pandemic. Obviously, when you're locked down in home, online looks pretty good. Are they going to be permanent? Have we reached some sort of tipping point or some sort of fundamental change? What I'm going to do is to think about really basic first year and to try and understand those issues. So we're going to ask, well, in terms of what's changed, have there been fixed costs that either consumers or businesses have invested during the pandemic, which may change their future behaviour? How much of those fixed costs are sunk? Even if they are, when the pandemic changes, have those changes, have those investments led to fundamental changes in the marginal calculus that consumers will face? At the margin, will they say, yep, this new way is better for me, or the old way, quite frankly, now I'm able to get back to my old ways, I'm going to do them. Third factor, competitors. So, for example, with retail, competitors aren't just going to sit there and say, well, the pandemic's rubbed us out, we're still in existence, but, look, we've been beaten by online, for example, we'll just give up. You'd expect competitors to fight back. How are competitors going to fight back? And finally, you'd expect to see the government being involved. Will the government set in place policies that essentially allow new ways of doing things to flourish, or will they be under pressure to protect the old ways and protect the older businesses? So these are the four things that we're really going to be looking at in the next couple of lectures. How we've had changes to fixed and sunk costs, changes to marginal costs, and we're going to look at changes about information, competitor responses and government responses. But that's it for now. Look forward to talking to you next time.